Chapter 223, Mixed-Blooded 4. I'll try to make it so that the embroidered uniform guard's apprentices can also be deployed to the underground Golden Jade. Ho ho. At the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard's words, Mok Jae-eun stroked his chin. It was a better proposal than he had thought. Infiltrating as an embroidered uniform guard was a prerequisite, and the next most necessary requirement was a justification to enter the underground Golden Jade. The plan devised by the advance team was to go through Noble Imperial Concubine Seo. Noble Imperial Concubine Seo had an elder brother. Seo Jiam, the elder brother of Noble Imperial Concubine Seo, who was originally a common soldier from a small county, had risen to the position of commander thanks to the emperor's favor during her time as a noble consort before her child became the crown prince. However, it was impossible for everything to go smoothly. Assigned to the northern Ningxia region, he was merely a former common soldier, so his commanding experience was inevitably lacking. He failed to stop the Great Xiongnu, losing 30,000 soldiers and even the territory. Strip Commander Seo Jiam of his position and execute him. Naturally, countless impeachment memorials poured in. However, the emperor, who cherished noble consort Seo, couldn't bring himself to kill her elder brother. As a result, he was stripped of his position as commander and exiled to a remote island. A few years later, when the child born to noble consort Seo ascended as the crown prince, he was moved to the underground Golden Jade of the imperial palace under the pretext of being the maternal uncle of the next emperor. Your Majesty, my elder brother is also deeply repenting for his sins. Your Majesty, my elder brother no longer has any ambition for official positions. Noble Imperial Concubine Seo had been working tirelessly to pardon her elder brother Seo Jiam, but due to the severity of his crime, her efforts were repeatedly thwarted by opposition from other factions. It was a regrettable situation for her, but it naturally served as a suitable justification to enter the underground Golden Jade. Attempt to visit the underground Golden Jade accompanied by Noble Imperial Concubine Seo and rescue the imprisoned guardian of the Fire Faith Order. That was the original plan and had the highest probability of success. However, if another method of infiltration emerged here, there would be no need to persuade Noble Imperial Concubine Seo or fulfill her unnecessary demands. It can avoid troublesome situations, but at this point Mok Jae-eun had to take another step further. It was because, in addition to the secret mission from the society leader, there was also a confidential order from the Shadow Clan master. If the escape is successful, seize the guardian again. As a member of the Fire Faith Order, the Shadow Clan master had given Mok Jae-eun a confidential order. This was currently a very contradictory situation. To become the fourth disciple of the society leader, he needed to safely rescue the guardian, and through this he could approach the society leader. However, if he failed the mission, that opportunity would be lost. Mok Jae-eun continued to ponder over this. If he ignored the Shadow Clan master's confidential order without any countermeasures, he would surely become enemies with him. That would lead to another troublesome situation. What should I do? However, now that there were two routes to infiltrate the underground Golden Jade, there was room to devise something along the way. After staring intently at the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard, Mok Jae-eun seemed to have sorted out his thoughts and spoke with a slight smile. All right. Let's accept that proposal. Is this enough? No. Of course, this alone is insufficient. In the end, I'll be the one taking the risk of entering the underground Golden Jade. Then what do you want? Naturally, you'll have to cooperate with me until I accomplish that. Cooperate with you? Yes. That much should be done to balance the scales, don't you think? Although he was inwardly dissatisfied with Mok Jae-eun's words, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard had no choice but to silently accept them since he was not the one holding the reins. The blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard nodded and said, "Fine. Then." The blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard silently glanced at his abdomen. Mok Jae-eun chuckled and said, "If the task is completed without incident, I'll remove the poison goo for you." What? Is this your first time making a deal? Have you ever seen someone pay the price before receiving the goods? The blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard, who had been clenching his fists and trembling, finally let out a long sigh and replied, "Understood." In any case, he had no other choice. Although it was close to a gamble, he had to hope that the fellow would keep his promise. Well then, now that the deal is made. Step. Mok Jae-eun approached Song-a, the daughter of the Hongbong meat craftsman, to release her acupuncture points. The blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard, watching Mok Jae-eun, suddenly seemed to remember something and spoke. "Can I ask you one thing?" "Go ahead and ask." Mok Jae-eun readily agreed as if it didn't matter. The blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard then asked, "Do you happen to have the surname Jean?" "The surname Jean?" "Yes." At his question, Mok Jae-eun shrugged his shoulders and shook his head. "No." "Then is it the surname So, or?" "All sorts of surnames are coming up. It's the Mok family." "The Mok family?" "Ah." At Mok Jae-eun's answer, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard's eyes trembled. He had asked out of curiosity, but it wasn't the case. That meant he had truly learned it just by observing his martial arts. He was truly a monstrous fellow. Well, one had to be at this level to be considered to have the talent of a true grandmaster. The blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard clicked his tongue and said, "You really stole and learned the lightness skill." "Ah, that lightness skill? It was quite useful." "May I ask the name of the footwork?" "You have no conscience after taking someone else's technique." "I'm asking because you acknowledged it." At those words, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Wind Cloud No. Wind God Step. 1. Wind God Step? The Wind God. It's an arrogant name, but it suits it in a way." At Mok Jae-eun's evaluation, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard inwardly apologized to his master. "I'm sorry. I had no choice." Originally, the true name of the footwork was Wind Cloud Step. However, he couldn't accurately reveal the details of the lightness skill, so he changed the name. At that moment, Mok Jae-eun said, "Since we've already exchanged one thing, can I ask one more question?" "What is it?" "I heard that people from the western regions have brown or blonde hair. But your hair is black. Did you dye it with ink or something?" "As expected." At this question, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard's eyes sharpened. As expected, this fellow was no different from others. Judging by how he suddenly showed interest in his unique appearance, which differed from others. However, when he unintentionally looked at Mok Jae-eun with disappointment, contrary to the question he had asked, he had a dry and indifferent expression, as if he had no particular feelings. What? Was it truly a question out of pure curiosity? Looking at the look in Mok Jae-eun's eyes, it was neither more nor less than that. It seemed quite different from other people. He even remembered the look in his master's eyes when he first saw him. Come to think of it, that fellow had shown no particular reaction upon seeing his face. It was no different from how ordinary people looked at him. Because of that, he felt strange. He was truly a peculiar fellow. In this case, he would have normally ignored it, but this time he answered, "It's because I'm mixed blood." His mother was from the Central Plains, while his father was from the Western regions. As a result, he was born different from both the people of the Western regions and the Central Plains, resenting his parents throughout his life. Mixed blood? I see. So that's why. However, that was all there was to Mok Jae-eun's reaction. As soon as he heard the answer to his question, he turned his head as if his curiosity had been satisfied. "Is that all?" The response was so underwhelming that he even wondered if he had been unnecessarily sensitive. Tatatap. Mok Jae-eun soon released Song-a's acupuncture points. As the acupuncture points were released and she could hear sounds again, she distanced herself from Mok Jae-eun with a disgusted face. This was why she didn't want to get close to martial artists. Regardless of her attitude, Mok Jae-eun paid no heed to it and reached out his hand somewhere. Swish. The leather pouch on the ground flew into Mok Jae-eun's hand. Seeing this, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard spoke in a startled manner. "Wait. I need to take that." "I said it was not possible. I also need to take the craftsman's severed hands." At Mok Jae-eun's words, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard pointed to Song-a and said, "Those aren't the craftsman's hands." "What? What do you mean?" "Exactly as I said. They used a fake instead of the real craftsman." "A fake?" At this, Mok Jae-eun looked at Song-a. Song-a nodded and replied, "The embroidered uniform guard mister is correct. The master whose arms were severed is just an ordinary butcher." "An ordinary butcher? Then could it be that you're also a fake?" At Mok Jae-eun's question, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard said, "That young lady is not a fake." How do you know whether she's a fake or not, Thousand Men Commander? You can tell by looking at her hands. Hands. At this, Mok Jae-eun looked at Song-a's hands. Every joint of her fingers was peeled to the point where fingerprints were not visible, and there was not a single intact spot. Just by looking at this, one could tell that she was not an ordinary person. My father is the real craftsman. So, in conclusion, I was deceived by the fake one. Yes. She replied in a groveling voice. Oh my. At this, Mok Jae-eun clicked his tongue lightly. Then there was no need to go through the trouble of finding the severed arms. However, there was no need to blame this. Thanks to being deceived like this, a new route to enter the underground Golden Jade had emerged. You could say it was a blessing in disguise. Then there's no need to take these hands, right? Although it's unfortunate for him, it seems this is the best way to prevent the situation from escalating. That's reasonable. At Song-a's words, Mok Jae-eun threw the leather pouch he was holding to the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard. The blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard sighed as he caught it. If he didn't take this with him, things would get complicated and that fellow would throw a fit. Eek. Wh, what are you doing? Song-a, who was suddenly picked up and carried on Mok Jae-eun's shoulder like a sack, was flustered and didn't know what to do. Regardless, Mok Jae-eun paid no attention to her. I can't match the young lady's walking pace. So let's head back quickly. Then Thousand Men Commander, I'll see you later. Mok Jae-eun gave a light bow to the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard and was about to leave. As he was about to take a step, Mok Jae-eun paused for a moment and said, I almost forgot. I said I'd see you later, but I don't even know your name. My name is Mok Jae-eun. What is your name, embroidered uniform guard Thousand Men Commander? At his question, the blue-eyed embroidered uniform guard briefly replied. Ma Are Hyen. Swish swish. Ugh. Song-a closed her eyes tightly, feeling frightened by the movement that was so fast that her surroundings were not visible. Mok Jae-eun, who had been using his lightness skill, suddenly stopped midway after a short distance. She wondered why, but it was because he had encountered someone along the way. It was none other than Seop Chun. Pai Lord. Mok Jae-eun asked him with a puzzled expression. I told you to wait, so why did you come all the way here? There was something urgent to inform you about, and I thought I should come and assist you. Something urgent to inform me about? At Mok Jae-eun's question, Seop Chun glanced at Song-a, who was being carried on his shoulder, and said, It's about that young lady. This person. Yes. My lord, you may feel displeased, but the master whose arms were severed was not the real craftsman. Ah, you mean that? I already know. You already know? Yes. As you can see. So, did you come to inform me about that? Ah yes. That's one thing, but the real craftsman urgently requested me to save that young lady, his daughter. However, contrary to his concerns, seeing that Mok Jae-eun had rescued her was a relief. In fact, he had rushed over because he thought his lord might only bring back the severed hands. Still, it was a good thing that he had saved the craftsman's daughter. Just then Mok Jae-eun asked. Well, since I ended up fulfilling the request, that's fortunate. So who did you say the real craftsman was? Do you remember the man with a lot of hair who was guiding us? Ah, that person? Yes. He was the real craftsman. At Seop Chun's words, Mok Jae-eun shook his head and suddenly chuckled. Puzzled by his laughter, Seop Chun asked. Why are you laughing? At that question, Mok Jae-eun suddenly put down Song-a, whom he had been carrying on his shoulder. Song-a also looked at Mok Jae-eun, unable to understand the situation. Mok Jae-eun then said to her, Perhaps because your work is secretive, deceiving people seems to have become a daily occurrence for you. What do you mean by that? I have an exceptionally good memory. Having a good memory, what does that? Among the hairy man and the butchers there, no one had the same palms as the young lady. At these words, Song-a's expression stiffened, seemingly startled. Mok Jae-eun then placed his hand on her shoulder, smiled brightly and said, I thought the craftsman who made human skin masks would be a man with some age, but that wasn't necessarily the case. Seop Chun's eyes widened at those words as he looked at Song-a. My lord, could it be? Yes. It seems this young lady is the real craftsman. Chapter 224, Lady Seo, the Imperial Noble Consort 1. Your Highness, surely not? Yes. It seems this young lady is the real master artisan. At Mok Jae-un's meaningful words, Song-ah, who had been introduced as the daughter of Master Hong Bong-yuk, stood with a stiff expression before sighing deeply. Phew. It doesn't seem like you'll believe me no matter what I say. That's right. I'm convinced that you're the real master artisan. Mok Jae-un remembers everything he sees. That's why he also remembers the palms of all the people at Hong Bong-yuk's slaughterhouse. Most of them had calloused and rough hands, but anyone could tell it was from years of working in the slaughterhouse. However, only Song-ah's palms were different. Her unhealthy palms weren't the type that could be formed from slaughtering. They were the kind of palms one could only get from doing delicate work or handling a lot of glue. Mok Jae-un smiled and said to her, "Is there any point in trying to deceive me further?" At this, Song-ah shrugged her shoulders and replied, "I suppose not. No one has ever observed my palms this intently before, so I've been properly caught." Seop Chun asked in amazement at her unapologetic attitude, "Are you truly the master artisan, young lady? Why, is it hard to believe that a young woman makes human skin masks?" "That's not what I meant. It was simply unexpected." "Unexpected, huh? Well, I suppose it could be. You might think this kind of work that earns one the title of master should be done by an older, experienced man, but unfortunately, I am that master artisan." Now that she had been exposed anyway, she candidly revealed her true thoughts. Then looking at Mok Jae-un, she said, "I didn't intentionally deceive you. My life has been threatened more than once or twice while doing this work. There have also been many who coveted this technique and tried to forcefully recruit me into their organizations. It was to protect yourself." "Yes. Then how else could I protect myself? I don't know martial arts like all of you or have power like Sir Embroidered Uniform Guard." Hiding behind a fake identity was her way of safeguarding herself. Understanding this, Seop Chun nodded and spoke. "That's perfectly understandable. Then can you keep my secret?" "Secret?" "Yes, a secret. If my true identity is revealed, I'll be subjected to threats once again." "Ah, of course we'll keep it. Our purpose is simply to commission human skin masks, not to threaten or inconvenience you, young lady." "That's a relief then. I trust you'll also keep this secret, sir?" Song-ah shifted her gaze to Mok Jae-un as she asked. Mok Jae-un crossed his arms, smiled and replied, "That's not difficult. However, such requests always come with a price, don't they?" "A price?" "The price is that I'll take on your commission. Something you were going to do originally can't be considered a price." "Huh. Then what are you suggesting?" "Personally, I have one favor to ask of you." "A favor?" As she echoed back, Mok Jae-un approached and whispered quietly in her ear, "I'd simply like to observe how you make the human skin masks, if that's all right." At Mok Jae-un's words, Song-ah scoffed inwardly. She felt like she knew what this man's ulterior motive was. Seemed he wanted to know how she crafted the human skin masks. However, unfortunately, this wasn't something one could imitate just by watching. One had to be born with deft hands. And without knowing her secret methods for producing the necessary chemicals, it would be difficult to even preserve the human skin. Thus she readily agreed. "Do as you please. Watch all you want. As if that'll allow you to do anything." But then Mok Jae-un said, "Thank you for allowing it. And this is just out of simple curiosity, but may I ask you something?" "What is it?" "Is it possible to directly peel off a person's facial skin and use it as a human skin mask?" "Excuse me." "Ah, I just thought that would be much more efficient." At Mok Jae-un smiling and nonchalantly saying something so revolting, a chill ran down her spine. As the sun set, Mok Jae-un and his group, having successfully completed the commission for human skin masks and taken a brief rest in the afternoon, were following Gonyong, the leader of the advance party, to a certain location. It was a restaurant located not far from the outer palace of the imperial court. Known for its famous fried duck dishes, this large-scale restaurant with a lavish exterior was a high-end establishment frequented by nobles and even imperial family members. Pointing to the restaurant's wall in the distance with numerous lanterns lit, Gonyong said, "Yubong has likely reserved the entire place." "Reserved the entire restaurant?" "Yes. Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort dislikes having her meals interrupted. And the conversation today isn't something that should reach the ears of others." Reserving the entire restaurant meant renting out the whole establishment. As it was such a famous place, it must have cost a pretty penny. Mok Jae-eun looked at the several dozens of armored soldiers guarding the vicinity of the restaurant's walls and remarked, "There are a lot of guards. This is actually quite normal. If we move just a bit further from the palace, hundreds of guards will accompany her. His Majesty the Emperor's favor is no joke. Yes, there's that. And given Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort's status as the mother of the Crown Prince, that level of precaution is taken. That makes sense. Shall we go then? Before that, there's one more thing I must tell you." At Ganyong's words, Mok Jae-eun stopped and turned his head. Ganyong then lowered his voice and said, "This matter is extremely important. No matter what Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort says, you must not get agitated or respond emotionally." This was why the excommunicated monk Jia Jiamzhong had been left to stay at the inn. In fact, Jia Jiamzhong was so notorious as one of the 3 mad ones that he had been separated just in case trouble occurred. However, the one Ganyong was truly worried about was Mok Jae-eun. "I'm worried." He considered the real uncontrollable one to be Mok Jae-eun rather than Jia Jiamzhong. Unlike Mong Muyak or Seop Chun from the rear party, he had a tendency to act according to his own will, so Ganyong was concerned he might accidentally provoke Lady Seo. That's why he was reminding him once more. Mok Jae-eun smiled at him as if telling him not to worry and said, "As Ganyong said he'd handle it, I'll simply observe." "I understand." If he could really do that, Ganyong would be truly grateful. With that, they headed towards the restaurant. Upon arriving at the restaurant's main gate, the soldiers guarding it blocked their path. "The entire restaurant has been reserved today, so no meals can be served. Please leave." Ganyong then took out a tile he had prepared from his bosom and showed it to them. The soldiers then bowed their heads as if they had been waiting for it. However, they couldn't pass through just like that. "We will hold on to your weapons for now." "Our weapons?" At his words, Ganyong and OKGI from the advance party handed over their weapons as if they had anticipated it to some degree. On the other hand, Seop Chun, Mong Muyak, and the others seemed displeased at having to relinquish their unique weapons, their expressions not very good. However, as they couldn't provoke the Imperial Noble Consort's temper, they had no choice but to hand over all their unique weapons and armaments. "You there, hand over your sword as well." The soldier pointed to Mok Jae-eun's evil commandment sword and spoke. Mok Jae-eun handed the sword's scabbard to the soldier and warned, "I'm telling you this just in case, but don't draw the sword from the scabbard." "What nonsense are you spouting?" "I'm just telling you out of concern." The soldier who received the evil commandment sword's scabbard snorted as if it was absurd. Mok Jae-eun then whispered in the soldier's ear, "It's a cursed sword, so if you carelessly draw it, you'll regret it." "What are you? If you're really curious, you can draw it. But you'll have to deal with the consequences yourself." At the ominous words that seemed to be a threat, the soldier frowned. However, knowing they were Lady Seo's guests, the soldier no longer showed any reaction and stepped aside. Thus, the group who had handed over their weapons entered through the main gate. Inside, the smell of fried duck that had been wafting out from the start, along with various spices, stimulated their appetite even more. "You've arrived." A familiar face was waiting in the front garden of the restaurant. It was Yubong, one of the advance party members. He greeted the group, wearing even more makeup than when they parted during the day, appearing like a eunuch. "Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort is waiting." At his words, Ganyong carefully asked, "How is Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort's mood?" "Ho ho. Fortunately, as this is a restaurant she greatly enjoys, she is in a good mood." "That's a relief." This was extremely important as the request could go either way depending on the Imperial Noble Consort's mood. "Then please follow me this way." With quick steps, Yubong led the group to the VIP room where the Imperial Noble Consort was. In front was a small pond and before that was a pavilion. Thin Raimi fabric curtains hung around the pavilion, and the silhouette of someone presumed to be Lady Seo could be seen inside, along with 2 shadows thought to be palace maids attending to her. Swish. Mok Jae-eun swept his eyes around. There was a considerable number of hidden presences that couldn't be seen. Around 30 people. They all seemed to be first-rate masters who had cultivated martial arts, qualitatively on a different level from the soldiers outside. And in front of the pavilion were 2 middle-aged men who appeared to be extraordinary. One was a man wearing black official robes, clean-shaven and with a powdered face like Yubong, seeming to be a eunuch. The other middle-aged man was wearing neat gray official robes and had a willow leaf saber at his waist. That eunuch must be Eastern Depot's leader, Sogam. Mok Jung-un had heard from Ganyang beforehand that there was a eunuch from Eastern Depot who guarded Lady Seo. The head of the Eastern Depot eunuchs was called Palace Eunuch Taegam. Under this Taegam were two junior supervisor Sogam. Both of these Sogam were said to have mastered the secret martial arts passed down through generations in the imperial palace. And indeed, the aura they exuded was no ordinary matter. However, the other person standing on the left side in a gray official robe was unknown. Who is that? Ganyang also seemed to be unaware of his identity. At that moment Yubong announced, "Your Majesty, the guests have arrived." With those words, Yubong sent a signal with his eyes to Ganyang and Mok Jung-un. Led by Ganyang, they joined their hands and bowed their heads in a formal greeting. "We pay our respects to Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort." As they offered their greetings, Lady Seo, reflected in the curtains, showed no reaction. They had expected a light greeting in return, so this was unexpected. Thus they all had to remain with their heads bowed. What's going on? According to Yubong, Lady Seo was supposedly in a good mood. But what was the meaning of this? As silence flowed, the atmosphere was quite peculiar. At that moment, the leader of Eastern Depot standing on the right side of the pavilion opened his mouth. How impudent! What kind of lowly servants greet Her Majesty in such a manner? Immediately kneel and pay proper respects. At these words, Ganyang, who had been bowing his head, frowned. He hadn't expected them to nitpick about etiquette right from the start like this. They're trying to gain the upper hand. Ganyang clicked his tongue inwardly as if troubled. He had anticipated to some degree that Lady Seo wanted to change this relationship that had lasted long since her days as a noble consort. But it was a rough start right off the bat. Chapter 225. Lady Seo, the Imperial Noble Consort 2. The leader of Eastern Depot raised his voice. "Oh my, how impudent not to kneel even then." At his shout, Ganyang, the leader of the advance party, calmly steadied his breathing. This was undoubtedly an attempt to gain the upper hand. Getting agitated here would only ruin matters. No choice. Right now, the side in the disadvantageous position wasn't Lady Seo but themselves. Thus, Ganyang knelt on one knee, bowed his head and greeted with even more decorum. "We pay our respects to Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort." The other members then surreptitiously glanced at Mok Jung-un to gauge his reaction. Mok Jung-un slightly raised the corners of his mouth, then knelt on one knee like Ganyang and joined his hands in a formal greeting. Seeing this, the others followed suit and paid their respects. "We pay our respects to Her Majesty the Imperial Noble Consort." At their deferential greetings, the leader of Eastern Depot turned his head to look at Lady Seo sitting beyond the curtains. He was seeking her opinion on how to proceed. They could make them fully prostrate to show even more respect, but these were people from the martial world. If they kept provoking them unnecessarily, it could lead to trouble, so they needed to moderate the pressure they applied. Lady Seo lightly raised her hand. The leader then spoke to the kneeling group. "Her Majesty has accepted your greetings, so rise." "This is different from what I heard." Ganyang clicked his tongue inwardly. According to Yubong, who had infiltrated as a Eastern Depot eunuch, it was true that Lady Seo had gained absolute power after becoming the Imperial Noble Consort. However, she hadn't forgotten the support from the Heaven and Earth Society all this time, so she would maintain a certain level of propriety. But the current atmosphere was not like that at all. Rather, she seemed intent on thoroughly establishing the hierarchy from the start. As they were currently in the disadvantageous position of needing to make a request, they had no choice but to go along with it for now, but it was increasingly worrying. "The guests shall sit at the tables prepared on either side." The leader gestured to the neatly arranged dining tables on both sides. The pavilion could be considered the seat of honor, with the area in front being the lower seats. This is why you don't deal with imperial family members or palace people. Those bastards think they're the center of the world. Chong Ryong spoke in an irritated voice. She had experienced a time when the government and martial world were strictly separate, so she didn't like this situation very much. Of course, Mok Jung didn't seem to mind at all as he quietly went and sat in an empty seat. Once everyone was seated, a voice came from inside the pavilion. "Raise the curtains." "Your Majesty, how could?" "I said to raise them." "As you command." The palace maids inside then lifted the curtains that had been obscuring the interior of the pavilion. This revealed an exquisite feast that made the tables groan under its weight and a beautiful woman wearing red, splendid clothes that exuded dignity and allure. Siep Chun almost let out an exclamation without realizing it. Seeing her breathtaking beauty even though she was over 30, he could understand why the emperor favored her so much. Moreover, as one of the 4 great evils who held sway over the power of this nation, there was something overwhelming about her presence that seemed to suck you in, along with her beauty. She opened her mouth. "You must be tired from the long journey." Ganyang bowed his head and replied, "Not at all, Your Majesty. Rather, we are ashamed to have you meet us in such a humble place." He tried his best to ingratiate himself with her. However, Lady Xiao snorted at his words and said, "Enough, this isn't the palace, so there's no need to flatter me with such empty words." "My apologies." How troublesome. He didn't know which tune to dance to. If he didn't flatter her, he would be called impudent, and if he did, it would be considered insincerity. He couldn't understand why she was being so sharp from the very beginning when they hadn't even properly brought up the main topic yet. There is one contingency plan, but he hoped it wouldn't come to the point of using that. Because if they used that plan, it would mean losing Lady Xiao as a card along with this current matter. However, the society had told them to complete the mission by any means necessary. That implied they were prepared to discard this card as well. But I won't let it go that far. Ganyang opened his mouth, trying his best to put on a smiling face to lighten the mood. "Your Majesty, the duck meat at this Wyong pavilion is unparalleled. I told you there's no need for flattery." At her words, not only Ganyang but all the members of the Heaven and Earth Society had stiff expressions. Anyone could tell Lady Xiao's tone was sharp. She still didn't know their true purpose. She only thought they wanted her authority to allow them to participate in the Imperial Guard's martial arts competition. The cunning woman had counter-demanded they send late-stage disciples from the society's main branch in response to this request. The reason was that even in the orthodox martial world, it would lack justification to send late-stage disciples from the old demons sect or renowned martial families to the Imperial Guard's martial arts competition. We agreed to this, so why is she being so sharp? It didn't make sense. However, as he had resolved to endure any humiliation, Ganyang spoke without revealing much. "I was trying to lighten the mood with some casual conversation, but it seems I've unintentionally displeased Your Majesty. Please be magnanimous." "Enough, let's cut to the chase and get to the main point." "Pardon? Didn't you hear me? I said let's get to the main point." Ganyang frowned at Lady Xiao's words. He had prepared gifts and planned to bring up the main issue when the mood mellowed over dinner. But he was baffled by her abruptly bringing it up like this. "Your Majesty. Why do you look so surprised? We're just going to discuss what has already been communicated between us." "That's true, but for you to bring it up so quickly is truly disconcerting. You planned to wait until the mood was right before bringing up the real matter, but I've thoughtlessly disrupted that flow, haven't I?" Ganyang's eyes narrowed at her words. Until a moment ago he had simply thought it was an issue with Lady Xiao's mood. But it seemed that wasn't the case. Surely not. Swish. Ganyang's gaze then shifted to Yubong, who was standing next to the leader of Eastern Depot. As if by chance, Yubong's eyes met his and he covered his mouth with his sleeve, showing a smiling expression towards Ganyang. It looked almost like a sneer. Seeing this, Ganyang's eyes trembled. He had a suspicion, but it seemed his unfounded worries had come to pass. "You bastard." As Ganyang glared at him, Yubong's lips moved slightly. Judging by the shape of his mouth. "My apologies. Just a few hours ago." The leader of Eastern Depot patted Yubong's shoulder as he exited West Benevolence Palace. And spoke. "Pat pat. Good work. Have you finished your report?" "Yes, sir." "Oh. With this, Her Majesty will trust you even more, eunuch you." "No, Inspector you." "Inspector? What do you?" Among the eunuch ranks, the highest first-grade eunuch was called Taegam. Below that were Sogam, Inspector, Attendant, and ordinary eunuchs without specific positions. Originally, Yubong was just an ordinary eunuch. The leader spoke to him with a satisfied expression. "Her Majesty has ordered your promotion and salary increase for this matter." At the leader's words, Yubong bowed with a flushed face to express his gratitude. I am simply grateful. He was truly delighted to become an inspector with the 5th grade court rank. He had thought he would spend his life as a society agent after being castrated, becoming neither man nor woman. But the leader had pulled him out of that pit. Just because one was a eunuch didn't mean they couldn't advance in the world. They could climb even higher. I'm not who I used to be. The leader had corrected his misguided thoughts. He couldn't end his life as a mere agent or low-ranking eunuch, could he? Yubong cautiously said to the leader. Leader, will you also teach me new techniques as promised? New techniques? Of course. How could that be difficult for someone who will become the right-hand man of Jango Take? Ho ho ho. At his words, Yubong was overjoyed inwardly. He had only learned inner energy cultivation and 4 techniques, but in just 1 year, they had made him stronger than Ganyang or OKGI, the Rising Phoenix Imperial Secret Art. What would happen if he mastered it completely? The leader tightly grasped his trembling shoulder, likely from excitement, and spoke with a sharp smile. There is much to be done for Her Majesty and His Highness the Crown Prince. Continue to do as you have. I shall keep that in mind. I shall surely keep it in mind. Seeing the shape of Yubong's mouth, Ganyang inwardly realized. He had betrayed the society. Most of the agents sent undergo a thorough loyalty test. Because if even one agent turns their back or acts as a double agent, it could lead to a major incident that blows back on them. Thus, most of the agents deployed in the field not only go through loyalty tests but also have restrictions or various sanctions placed on them. However, Yubong seemed to be free from that, though he didn't know what method he used. This is the worst. He hadn't anticipated a traitor emerging in this situation of all times. He didn't know what Yubong had told Lady Xiao, but it was clear their request had hit a snag. At this rate he would have no choice but to pull out his final card. Just then Lady Xiao opened her mouth. How bold. No matter how favorably I view you all, to think you would dare try to break out a criminal imprisoned in the underground palace prison. Your Majesty, that is committing treason. Ganyang's mind grew complicated at her accusation. Her words were very different from before. It seemed Yubong had thoroughly informed her of their objectives. Ganyang calmly opened his mouth again. Your Majesty. How could we? Shut that mouth. You dare try to involve me in an act of treason and still have the gall to prattle on with that loose tongue of yours. You all should be grateful you aren't immediately executed. Swish. As she raised her hand, the hidden experts revealed themselves. As they already knew they had been concealing their presence, neither the advance party nor the rear party was surprised by this. The problem was that the situation had become complicated. Lady Xiao's lips twitched at their disconcerted appearance. She recalled the conversation she had a few hours ago with the leader of Eastern Depot and the middle-aged man in gray official robes on the left side. Your Majesty, why don't you try using this against them? Leader, what do you mean by that? If you agree to their demands, it could bring great harm to both you and His Highness the Crown Prince. Who doesn't know that? But they have supported me since my days as a noble consort, so they may hold even the tiniest weakness against me. That is why you must take advantage of this situation. Lady Xiao asked in puzzlement at his words. What do you mean? You must cut ties with such thuggish people for the sake of His Highness the Crown Prince's future anyway. This will provide sufficient justification. Justification? Yes. First you must overwhelm them and break their spirit. Overwhelm them. They also know how much this request will harm Your Majesty, so they will approach cautiously. However, if Your Majesty takes the initiative, they will have no choice but to be put in a difficult position. Even so, do you think they will give up easily? Of course not. Then what do you suggest next? After overwhelming them, once it is clearly imprinted that their demands are unreasonable, make a counter-demand. Make a demand. Yes, that is correct. According to Eunuch Yu, no, Inspector Yu, they will have to agree to any demand in order to fulfill their mission. Oh, do go on. Then Your Majesty should demand this of the pressured group, to take the life of either Prince Zhang or Consort Ho. Prince Zhang. He was the second prince and originally the most likely candidate for Crown Prince. Although Lady Xiao's son had been appointed as Crown Prince, there were still many ministers who followed Prince Zhang, making him a thorn in her side. And Consort Ho. She hadn't entered the palace that long ago. She was just a young girl who used to be a palace maid, But without any backing, she had bewitched the emperor with her beauty alone and risen to the rank of consort in just 3 years. Although the emperor's favor was still focused more on herself, that wench was still only 22 years old while she was approaching her mid-30s. As this balance could collapse at any time, Consort Ho was the one she most wanted to kill. However, despite making several attempts to eliminate these two, she had failed each time. In Prince Zhang's case, it was unavoidable as he had many followers, but Consort Ho was utterly incomprehensible. Have them take the life of either Prince Zhang or Consort Ho. That is correct. What if they refuse? Would the Heaven and Earth Society really take on such a risk? This was an extremely dangerous matter for them as well. You needed a justification to end your relationship with them anyway, so you can use this as an excuse. Oh, if they agree, that would be beneficial in its own way. Indeed. But if that happens, I will also have to aid them. What if that ends up holding me back? You need not worry about that. Don't worry, you say? If they succeed in taking the life of Consort Ho or Prince Zhang in response to the demand, we can definitively deal with them by linking it to the crime of helping a prisoner escape. At the leader's words, the middle-aged man in gray official robes who had been listening silently opened his mouth. If that happens, we shall protect your majesty and his highness the crown prince from the evil bunch of the unorthodox faction, the Heaven and Earth Society. Lady Xiao, the corners of her mouth slightly curling up. Everything was perfect. She was grateful to the Heaven and Earth Society for supporting her both materially and spiritually in her rise to this position. But this was as far as it went. She knew they had supported her like this to use the crown prince and herself as puppets from behind the scenes. Therefore, she would properly make use of them one last time before discarding them. To that end, she had demanded they send proper late-stage disciples so they couldn't back out even after causing trouble. No matter what, you will all dance in the palm of my hand. Lady Xiao sent a meaningful look to the leader of Eastern Depot on her right. It meant to definitively suppress them. The leader slightly nodded his head and likewise signaled with his eyes to the middle-aged man in gray official robes on the left side. The one his eyes pointed to was none other than Mok Jiangun. The middle-aged man nodded his head and half drew his willow leaf saber from his waist. Shing. The middle-aged man remembered what Yubong, now Inspector Yu, had said. There are no major problematic individuals in the advance party. However, among those who came with the rear party, 2 are the biggest issues. Who are they? Someone named Mok Jiangun and Mad Monk Jiajiamzhong. Mad Monk. At those words, the middle-aged man couldn't hide his shock. Mad Monk Jiajiamzhong was known as one of the 3 madmen with a notorious reputation. Even for someone like himself, if they fought, it might take several hundred moves before a victor was decided. Oh, don't worry. We'll make sure Mad Monk Jiajiamzhong can't come. But Sir Peng, you must definitely suppress the one named Mok Jiangun. Is he that formidable? Seeing as Mad Monk Jiajiamzhong follows him, he must be at least a step above him. That's surprising. To think he's a step above that crazy excommunicated monk. However, based on the energy he sensed, Mok Jiangun was at most only at the pinnacle stage of peak realm. He had heard this man could conceal his martial prowess, but he was a young lad not even in his prime yet, so he doubted if that was true. It was hard to believe a youngling like that was a step above the mad monk. But it doesn't hurt to be careful. Even in the orthodox martial world, there were geniuses called late-stage disciples who boasted tremendous martial arts. He just needed to think of it as fighting against such individuals. No matter how outstanding Mok Jiangun was, he had experience and years on his side. As long as he wasn't careless, he believed he could sufficiently suppress him. Moreover, if worse comes to worst, I can call for reinforcements. His younger brother was waiting outside as support. Although younger than him and somewhat frivolous in conduct, his brother's martial arts were a step above his own, even though he had taken the path of officialdom. Swish. Then shall we begin seizing the upper hand? The middle-aged man in gray official robes was about to fully draw the half-drawn willow leaf saber. At that moment, Mok Jiangun chuckled, picked up a piece of fried duck meat from the table with his chopsticks and put it in his mouth. He then chewed it thoroughly, swallowed with a gulp and said, "Delicious." Everyone's attention was now focused on Mok Jiangun. In a situation where things could erupt at any moment, even Lady Xiao snorted in disbelief at his nonchalant attitude, as if he was utterly carefree. Was this young man of outstanding appearance the top expert among the late-stage disciples sent by the Heaven and Earth Society that Eastern Depot's inspector you mentioned? The young lad seemed bold, but he didn't seem to grasp the situation. Swish. Lady Seo nodded her head at the middle-aged man in gray official robes. He then fully drew his willow leaf saber and approached Mok Jung-un while emanating a powerful aura. How impudent of you when Her Majesty is pressing you. It felt like the conversation was dragging on too long with delicious food in front of me. Disrespectful brat. I didn't express any particular complaints. Is simply tasting the food such a great disrespect? Put down those chopsticks at once and kneel. I only picked up and ate a single piece, yet you're being so petty. Ha. He seems quite confident in his own martial prowess, doesn't he? In that case, let's see how impressive he is. The middle-aged man in gray official robes took a deep breath, then raised his inner energy to the 8th level and swung his saber towards Mok Jung-un's neck with a tyrannical momentum. Swoosh. The middle-aged man naturally assumed Mok Jung-un would leap back to avoid this. However, clang. In that instant, the middle-aged man couldn't hide his shock. That was because Mok Jung-un had caught the blade of his willow leaf saber with mere chopsticks. To this bastard, who the hell? As he was taken aback, Mok Jung-un looked not at him but at Ganyong, the leader of the advance party sitting across from him, and spoke with a sharp smile on his lips. It seems wrong to just sit still. Don't you agree? Chapter 226, Lady Seo, the Imperial Noble Consort, 3. In the orthodox martial world, there are several renowned martial families. Among them, the 7 most prestigious martial arts clans are called the 7 Great Families. Of these 7 great families, there was a renowned clan in Hebei that was famous for their saber techniques. The martial artists referred to this clan as the Hebei Ping family. The current head of the Hebei Ping family, who held the real power, was Peng Il-Hien, a genius of the saber art known as the Hegemon saber of Hebei. In Hebei province, no one could match him in terms of saber techniques. Peng Il-Hien, the clan head, had 2 younger brothers with formidable martial prowess. One of them, the second brother Peng Imun, had set his sights on power early on and entered officialdom. Thanks to Peng Imun's government position, the Hebei Ping family could enjoy various benefits. And then there was the youngest brother, Peng Sukheim, whose character was the worst among the siblings. He was so fond of wine and women that he had been the subject of gossip several times, and despite being born into a renowned saber clan, he insisted on using the sword, earning the ire of the clan elders. However, despite this, the reason the Hebei Ping family still valued him was because his martial talent was so outstanding that he was almost on par with the clan head, Peng Il-Hien. Swish swish. Peng Sukheim, the youngest brother of clan head Ping, looked at the wall of the restaurant illuminated by lanterns and diligently wiped his sword blade with a cloth. Seeing this, a warrior beside him asked, "Senior brother, why are you paying so much attention to the sword blade?" "I have to. I might have a chance to show off impressively in front of Her Majesty later." "No. Do you really like the Imperial Noble Consort that much? How can you call yourself a man if you don't feel stirred by such a peerless beauty? Oh my. Watch your words. She is a woman who has an owner. And that owner was none other than the emperor who ruled this nation." Despite the warrior's words, Peng Sukheim snorted. "Humph. You can curse even the king if he's not in front of you. Senior brother. All right. Why are you making such a fuss? Anyway, you're really peculiar. But no matter how I think about it, doesn't she seem wasted on that old man?" The warrior clicked his tongue inwardly as he watched Peng Sukheim mutter to himself. He was a man with unparalleled martial talent, but whenever wine and women were involved, he lost his senses. After coming to the capital, he seemed to have regained his sanity by keeping his distance from such things, but now he was eyeing a tree he couldn't climb. She is indeed that beautiful, though. The warrior also couldn't help but admire Lady Seo's face when he first saw her. There were reasons why the aging emperor couldn't let her go. So he could understand Peng Sukheim's behavior. However, no matter how much Peng Sukheim was fond of wine and women, he would never dare to lay a hand on the emperor's woman. Unless he had multiple lives to spare, that is. Just then Peng Sukheim suddenly shifted his gaze somewhere. "Senior brother?" He was looking at a spot in front of the wall where several soldiers were stationed. They were examining and admiring the weapons they had confiscated from the martial artists of the Heaven and Earth Society who had entered the restaurant earlier. Among them they were swinging a saber with an exceptionally thin blade that fluttered in the wind. That saber is magnificent. Magnificent, you say? Yes. To have such a thin blade yet still maintain elasticity, it must have been crafted by a great master. Oh, is that so? It seems the Heaven and Earth Society has sent some fairly capable individuals. Isn't that a bad thing then? What's bad about it? We might have to go and provide support, no? Then that's a good thing. That way I can show off in front of Her Majesty, right? You're really something else. The warrior shook his head from side to side. Just then Peng Sukheim furrowed his brows. Senior brother? Are you perhaps angry? If so, I apologize. That sword. What the hell is it? Pardon. The warrior turned his head in the direction Peng Sukheim was looking and spotted a soldier holding a sword with a strange pattern engraved on it. However, the soldier was staring at the sword with a dazed expression. Something about the atmosphere felt off. Why is he acting like that? Senior brother? But Peng Sukheim was also transfixed on the sword, unable to take his eyes off it. He had a gaze as if he had discovered a tremendous treasure. At the same time, clang. Impossible. The leader of Eastern Depot's eyes went wide. That was because he never expected Ping Yimun's tyrannical slash, delivered with the momentum of the renowned expert of the Hebei Ping family, to be blocked by mere chopsticks. To be precise, it wasn't even blocked, but the saber blade was caught by the chopsticks. How can this be? The leader was inwardly baffled. Based on what Eunuch Yu, now Inspector Yu, had said, he knew that among the late-stage disciples sent by the Heaven and Earth Society, the young man with exceptional appearance had the most outstanding martial prowess. However, he had assumed that no matter how skilled he was, he would still only be at the level of a late-stage disciple. But to think he was a master capable of catching the saber of an expert from the Hebei Ping family, one of the renowned martial clans of the Orthodox world, in such a manner. Swish. The leader glanced at Yubong. Yubong was equally perplexed by the situation. No matter how strong Mok Jiangun was, he had predicted that he would be no match for Ping Yimun, an expert of the Hebei Ping family, but that prediction had been shattered. Amidst this, Mok Jiangun spoke with a sharp smile on his lips. It seems wrong to just sit still. Don't you agree? Gonyang couldn't hide his awkwardness at Mok Jiangun's words. The original plan had already gone awry. Lady Xiao's side trying to suppress them like this was likely to cut ties with the Heaven and Earth Society or to steer the situation in her desired direction. Gonyang was about to nod his head as if he had no choice, but... Clang. At that moment, the middle-aged man in gray official robes, Ping Yimun, tried to extract his saber by rotating it while it was caught by the chopsticks. However, his willow leaf saber, grabbed by the chopsticks, didn't budge an inch. Tremble, tremble, tremble. With this, Ping Yimun could clearly tell. This bastard's inner energy is stronger than mine. Even now he was already using a force close to the 9th level, the highest inner energy, yet this meant he was inferior to this fellow even in terms of inner energy. Peng Yimun's complexion darkened for a moment. This is absurd. Peng Yimun was a master whose skills were not only perfected but also near the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm. To overwhelm someone like him in terms of inner energy, it was impossible with just reaching the pinnacle stage of transcendent realm. That meant this young lad had to have crossed the wall. Impossible. How can a lad not even in his prime have reached the transformation realm? Even in the orthodox martial world, there weren't many who had reached the transformation realm. And among them, there was no one who had reached this realm in their teens. It was a realm that required long years of cultivation and high enlightenment, so Ping Yimun found it hard to accept. But the most certain thing was that he couldn't suppress this brat with his strength alone. Thus, no choice. Then, smack. Thud. Peng Yimun released the hilt of the willow leaf saber and forcefully struck the end of the saber handle with his palm. This was one of the secret techniques of the 5 tiger saber style, the saber breaking technique. It was a technique that shattered the saber blade by striking the handle with internal energy, sending the fragments imbued with energy flying towards the opponent. Clang, 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 clang. The saber fragments, shattered by the internal energy, rushed towards Mok Jiangun. Given the close distance and the fact that he was seated, Peng Yimun thought it would be impossible for him to dodge. But the moment the saber fragments touched Mok Jiangun's skin with the momentum to pierce through him, poof, 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 poof. Along with that, the saber fragments failed to penetrate Mok Jaeongun's body and instead slid off their trajectory, embedding themselves in various other places. What the hell is this? Surprised by this, Peng Iman hurriedly kicked the ground to create distance. Mok Jaeongun spoke to him as if intrigued. An interesting technique. To shatter your own saber and launch it like hidden weapons. What the hell are you? By identity? Even if the Heaven and Earth Society's executive, the Shadow Clan master, personally made a move, he wouldn't be able to block this technique so easily. If it were an executive of the Heaven and Earth Society at the level of the Five Kings, it would be somewhat understandable. Among them there were monsters who had received the title of 8 stars. But for a disciple of an executive at the clan master level of the Heaven and Earth Society to be this strong, not just them, was incomprehensible. It was truly a case of the student surpassing the teacher, wasn't it? You underestimate my master too much. It's not that I'm underestimating him. More importantly, since you aimed for my life, you'll have to pay the price accordingly. What? Swish. Mok Jaeongun plucked one of the embedded saber fragments with his index and middle fingers. Then he immediately launched it towards Peng Iman like a hidden weapon. Peng Iman hurriedly twisted his body sideways to dodge the incoming saber fragment. But that wasn't the end. Thud. The moment he twisted his body, Mok Jaeongun swiftly launched another saber fragment. The saber fragment flew accurately towards Peng Iman's neck. It was a situation impossible to evade, but... Clang. At that instant someone deflected it with a flexible sword. That someone was none other than the leader of Eastern Depot. Leader. Peng Iman, who had narrowly avoided having his neck pierced, sent a grateful look towards him. The leader then spoke urgently. Sir, it seems we'll have to collaborate in attacking this time. I agree. We. With those words, Peng Iman blew a whistle by sending inner energy through his mouth. This was a signal requesting assistance. Realizing that Mok Jaeongun was no ordinary expert, he judged that unless his younger brother waiting outside joined forces with him, they might suffer a defeat. The leader shouted at Yubong. Inspector Yu, lead the rest and deal with them. Why yes, sir. Although Yubong replied hastily, he was inwardly perplexed. His original plan was to have Peng Iman face Mok Jaeongun while he and the leader joined forces to suppress the rest. However, even with the support of first-rate warriors, Sip Chun and Mong Muyak, who had come with the rear party, were experts who had reached the transcendent realm. Gonyang and OKGI were also no ordinary individuals, so could they really hold them off? No. Don't show weakness. We just need to hold out until the Ping family's reinforcements arrive. They were already waiting outside anyway, so they would arrive soon. No matter how strong these people were, the tide of battle wouldn't turn in an instant. No choice. To think it would get complicated like this. Sip Chun and Mong Muyak stood up from their seats and assumed the starting posture of their fist techniques, facing the warriors surrounding them. It seemed it was already too late to turn the situation around. Gonyang and Okai also seemed to think they had ruined the matter, as they took a fighting stance while glaring at Yubong with resentful eyes. At that moment, Mok Jaeongun, the only one still seated, opened his mouth. Your Majesty, the Imperial Noble Consort. As the situation was on the brink of erupting, Mok Jaeongun suddenly addressing Lady Seo drew everyone's attention to him. Of course, Lady Seo herself was no exception. She had been quite surprised by Mok Jaeongun's martial prowess, which was more outstanding than expected. Although she wasn't well versed in martial arts, it was clear that his skills were no ordinary matter if the leader and Peng Iman, experts highly regarded even in the Imperial Palace, were attempting to collaborate in attacking him. Why have you addressed me? Lady Seo asked, puzzled. Mok Jaeongun then replied with a smile. I want to briefly tell you what will happen from now on. What will happen? Yes. Lady Seo furrowed her brows. What the hell was this bastard talking about? At that moment, the leader, who had been about to collaborate with Peng Iman, raised his voice and pressed. How impudent! How dare you, to Her Majesty? Hold on. Your Majesty? Lady Seo, who had stopped the leader, raised one eyebrow and spoke. You're quite a brazen one. So, what do you think will happen? Everyone except you will die here. For a moment she doubted her own ears. She had wondered what he was going to say, but was this scoundrel daring to intimidate her? However, Mok Jaeongun's words didn't end there. I heard you have many enemies, right? What? Since you want to let go of our hand anyway, it seems you have no more use for us. So how about we negotiate with them using your life as collateral? What do you think?